The glass doors sighed shut behind Camilla as she stepped into the bank lobby, carrying the tired smell of coffee and fryer oil on her red work shirt, the old envelope pressed carefully against her chest. Inside, everything glowed warm and golden. A tall Christmas tree twinkling with colored lights, garlands wrapped around marble columns, a soft carol floating from hidden speakers, as if the world were gentle and kind. Her feet ached from the long shift at the restaurant, but the thought of maybe paying the rent, maybe buying a small gift for Gabriel, kept her standing a little straighter. She moved toward the line with the shy care-day of someone who knows they're out of place, murmuring an apology when a man in a suit brushed past without looking at her. For one brief moment, as she looked at the bank's logo shining above the counters, she heard her grandmother's voice again. "One day you'll walk in there as a lady, not a shadow." Blake Harrington entered from the side hallway with the easy confidence of someone who had never once worried about rent, his laughter already echoing before anyone heard the joke. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, silk tie the color of deep wine, silver watch catching the light from the tree every time he moved his wrist. Employees straightened as he passed, their smiles a little too wide, their greetings a little too bright, because this visit was important, a Christmas gesture from the famous CEO. Blake barely noticed them. His eyes scanned the lobby as if the building itself belonged to him, and everyone inside were just moving parts. He stopped near the row of tellers, leaning against the counter with the relaxed arrogance of a man who knew cameras loved him. When his gaze slid over the waiting line, it snagged on the red-shirted waitress, clutching a worn envelope like it contained the world. Camilla's turn finally came, and she stepped to the counter, offering the teller a small, hopeful smile as she slid the envelope forward with both hands. "I'd like to check the balance, please," she said softly, pointing to the account number her grandmother had written years ago in careful blue ink. The teller's fingers danced over the keyboard, then hesitated when an odd message flashed on the screen. Something about a hold, a note, a corporate flag, too complicated for a busy Christmas Eve line. The manager appeared at the teller's shoulder with a pinched expression, glancing at Camilla's uniform, the tired circles under her eyes, the kind of quick assessment that measures worth by fabric and posture. "Probably nothing," he muttered under his breath, thinking it was safe not to lower his voice. Blake, standing just a few steps away, caught that phrase and turned fully toward them, drawn by the scent of what he considered entertainment. "And what do we have here?" Blake asked, his tone light but edged, like someone toying with a small object just to see how easily it breaks. He looked at the envelope, then at Camilla's name tag, reading it aloud with exaggerated courtesy. Camilla, as if tasting something foreign. "Checking the balance, huh? Busy night with tips?" A couple of employees behind him exchanged quick, uneasy glances, but no one spoke. The teller shifted, clearly uncomfortable, frozen between the fear of displeasing the CEO and the instinct to protect the nervous young woman in front of her. Camilla flushed, wishing she could shrink inside her own skin, and tried to answer politely that it was an old account from her grandmother, that she just wanted to know if anything was left. Blake threw his head back and laughed, a loud, ringing sound that seemed to bounce off the polished floor and the Christmas ornaments, turning the lobby into a stage. "Real accounts aren't usually for people like you," he said, still chuckling, waving one hand vaguely at her uniform, at the tired shoes, at the invisible label of service worker he had already stuck on her. "But hey, maybe there's something there. Some leftover tip change your grandma forgot to spend." The joke landed in the room like a slap. A couple of customers lowered their eyes, pretending to check their phones, while others froze, unsure whether to smile or disappear. Camilla's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white, her eyes burning, the envelope between her and the man suddenly feeling like a shield made of paper. And as the Christmas lights blurred in her vision and the laughter slowly died, a quiet, unfamiliar thought crept into her heart. Perhaps her grandmother had been wrong about this place. Or perhaps there was something inside that envelope they all would live to regret underestimating. The laughter still echoed in Camilla's ears, even after it stopped in the room, as if it had crawled inside her skull and found a place to live. She gathered the envelope with slow, clumsy fingers, nodding without really hearing the teller's rushed apology, her cheeks burning so hot she thought the skin might crack. No one touched her. No one said a sharp word to the man who had mocked her. They just shifted and sighed and pretended to be busy, as if her humiliation were a small spill that would dry on its own. Camilla turned away from the counter, eyes fixed on the floor, afraid that if she looked up, she would see pity, or worse, indifference. Every step toward the exit felt heavy, like walking through water, while the Christmas carol overhead kept playing, cheerful and cruelly out of tune with her chest. The glass doors opened with a soft hiss, and the cold air outside hit her face like a slap that at least belonged to the weather and not to a stranger's mouth. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, uncertain, the city lights blurring into streaks of color through the thin film of unshed tears. Cars passed, people hurried by with shopping bags and scarves, and no one knew that a whole piece of her dignity was lying back there on the polished floor. Camilla hugged the envelope to her chest as if it could keep her warm, the paper slightly damp where her hands trembled. She told herself not to cry, not here, not in front of the big glass windows where anyone inside could look out and see how deeply their joke had sunk. She took a long, shaky breath, tasting metal and old coffee on her tongue, and forced her feet to move. Behind the glass, the lobby settled into its normal rhythm again, printers humming, coins rattling in drawers, polite voices asking about deposits and withdrawals. Sarah, the young teller who had attended Camilla, kept her gaze on the screen, but her thoughts were still at the counter, replaying the scene. She had seen people treated badly before, but something about that girl in the red shirt, standing so still while the CEO laughed, made her stomach twist. Sarah remembered the calloused hands that slid the envelope forward, the careful way she'd spoken, apologizing for taking time she clearly thought she didn't deserve. Her own fingers hovered over the keyboard as if they didn't want to obey her anymore, and a quiet question began to form in her mind. What was really on that account? Trying to push away the discomfort, Sarah clicked back into the profile on her screen, eyes narrowing, when she noticed again the small line of text she had glimpsed earlier. A restricted note, a corporate flag, some internal code that did not usually appear on ordinary accounts, especially not on ones belonging to cleaners and waitresses. The tag read, "Heritage Shares C Corporate," a phrase that meant almost nothing to her but pulsed on the monitor like a tiny warning light. She glanced toward the manager's office, where Blake now stood laughing with him. Both men turned away from the lobby, oblivious to the quiet storm they had stirred. Sarah's heart beat faster, torn between the habit of obedience and the uneasy certainty that this file and that young woman deserved more than a shrug. Outside, Camilla reached the corner and stopped under a flickering street lamp, finally letting one tear slip down her cheek, quick and angry, before she wiped it away with the back of her hand. The envelope felt heavier now, as if the laughter had soaked into it, warping its edges, making it harder to hold close without remembering every word. She thought of her grandmother's stories about respect, about how a bank was supposed to be a safe place, and the words tasted like something broken in her mouth. Somewhere behind her, through the tinted glass, a single pair of eyes still watched the screen with her name on it, struggling to decide what to do. And as Camilla turned toward the bus stop, certain that nothing good could possibly come from that account, Sarah's cursor hovered over the flag one last time, the silent beginning of a choice that would follow them both, far beyond this cold Christmas night. The morning had started like so many others, long before the bank's cold lights and cruel laughter, with the soft beep of an old alarm clock and the smell of yesterday's coffee still in the pot. Camilla slipped out of bed carefully so as not to wake Gabriel, his small body curled under a blanket printed with faded stars. The apartment was small enough that every sound seemed to belong to all of them. From the creak in the kitchen floorboard to the whisper of the bathroom tap, she pulled on her red shirt and black apron, fingers moving through a routine her body knew better than her mind at that hour. On the fridge, Gabriel's drawing of a Christmas tree and a little house with a yellow window reminded her why she kept moving, even when the world pushed back. At the restaurant, the day unfolded in a familiar blur of orders shouted over sizzling grills, the clatter of plates, and the low murmur of conversations she was never quite part of. Coffee cups lined up like soldiers along the counter, and Camilla moved among the tables with practiced grace, balancing trays heavy with pancakes, burgers, and the occasional small kindness in the form of an extra $1 or two. Regular customers greeted her with the easy warmth reserved for someone who made their days smoother, but whose life they never thought to ask about. She smiled and joked when her feet weren't screaming, refilled cups before they were empty, and tucked each tip carefully into a separate pocket of her apron. Every bill she accepted carried a quiet calculation: rent, groceries, bus fare, Gabriel's school shoes, and each time she counted, the numbers were always just a little too close to the edge. When her shift finally ended and the lunchtime rush began to thin, she slipped into the small employee locker room at the back, where the fluorescent light buzzed and the air smelled faintly of detergent and old uniforms. From the back of her metal locker, she pulled out the worn envelope with the bank's logo and the folded letter that had traveled with her through every move since Elena's passing. The paper had softened with time, corners bent, the ink of her grandmother's careful handwriting faded but still steady. Until now, Camilla had treated that envelope like something halfway between a memory and a superstition, a relic she didn't dare disturb for fear of waking up and finding it had never existed. Today, though, the pressure of overdue rent notices and Gabriel's quiet question, "Will Santa know where we are if we move?" had pushed her beyond hesitation. She sat on the wooden bench, apron folded on her knees, the restaurant noise muffled behind the heavy door as if the world had stepped a little farther away to give her space. Slowly, she unfolded the letter, her eyes tracing the familiar first lines. Elena, talking about the long nights at the bank, the mops, the buckets, the way the marble floors shone when the day people arrived. There were stories of saving small amounts, coins from tips when she cleaned offices at other buildings, $1 bills from overtime, always set aside for you and your future, Minhaneta. Camilla felt her throat tighten as she read about the pride her grandmother had felt opening that account, the belief that money, no matter however little, could grow if treated with patience and respect. Each word felt like a hand on her shoulder, steadying her and reminding her that she came from more than just exhaustion and unpaid bills. Near the end of the page, her eyes caught a sentence she'd never finished before, the ink slightly darker as if Elena's hand had pressed harder. "I bought shares of the bank itself in your name, little by little, so that one day you wouldn't just stand in front of the counter, you would—" The line stopped there, mid-thought, as if the pen had been lifted and never returned, the promise hanging open over the yellowed paper. Camilla's heart skipped, caught between disbelief and a fragile, rising hope she hardly dared to name. She flipped the page, searching for the rest of the sentence. But there was only blank space and the faint impression of where the pen had almost touched again. For a long moment she sat frozen, the unfinished phrase echoing inside her like a doorway left ajar, not knowing that the first step through it would begin with a simple, trembling request to check the balance of a forgotten account. High above the city, where the streets were just thin lines of light, and the people below looked like moving dots, Blake Harrington's office glowed with a colder, harsher brightness than any Christmas decoration. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a painting chosen to match his suit, and the glass table in front of him held a neat arrangement of reports, tablets, and a steaming cup of imported coffee. Screens along the wall scrolled with market data, numbers rising and falling like waves he believed he controlled with a tilt of his hand. Blake leaned back in his leather chair, one ankle resting casually on his knee, listening with half an ear as his executives talked about quarterly results, public image, and community engagement. To him, they were all just different ways of saying the same word: profit. The head of public relations, a woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile, tapped her tablet and brought up a slideshow of smiling customers, decorated branches, and charity drives. "We think it would be good for you to visit one of the local branches for a Christmas photo op," she said, gesturing to an image of a modest lobby with a large tree. "Shake some hands, thank the staff, maybe talk to a few everyday clients. It humanizes the brand." Blake smirked, swirling his coffee as if he were stirring the fate of everyone in the pictures. "You want me to go hug the poor?" he said, and a few nervous chuckles scattered around the room. No one told him the joke wasn't funny. No one reminded him that his first job had once been behind a counter not so different from theirs. That part of his story had been buried under layers of success until even he no longer recognized it. While Blake approved the visit with a lazy nod, "Fine, pick a branch, make sure the cameras are there," Camilla was wiping down a sticky table at the restaurant, preparing to end another endless shift. The late afternoon light slanted through the front windows, catching the dust in the air and turning it into a soft haze around her tired movements. A family in the corner laughed over shared dessert, and for a moment Camilla watched them with a small, private smile, imagining Gabriel's face lit up like that over a slice of pie he didn't have to split. In the back of her mind, the unfinished sentence from her grandmother's letter played over and over, a quiet drumbeat. "So that one day you wouldn't just stand in front of the counter, you would." The words tugged her towards something she could not name, but could no longer ignore. When her manager finally waved her off, muttering something about schedules and holiday hours, Camilla changed in the cramped locker room, smoothing her red shirt and checking her reflection in the tiny mirror. She pulled the envelope from her locker, feeling again the fragile weight of her grandmother's hope between her fingers. Outside, the sky was turning the deep blue of early evening, Christmas lights flickering on one by one along the street like promises made to people she did not know. She counted the bills in her pocket, tips from the day, and knew they were not enough. The decision came quietly like a breath. She would go to the bank, just to see, just to make sure there was truly nothing there before she gave up on that old dream forever. In his tower, Blake stood before the window, watching his reflection blend with the city beyond, adjusting his tie as an assistant confirmed the details of the visit. A small branch, festive decorations, a chance to be photographed connecting with real people. He nodded, amused by the phrase, and asked only whether the security team had cleared the route and the press had been instructed to capture the right angles. Somewhere far below, on a bus that rattled its way through crowded streets, Camilla sat with the envelope resting on her knees, tracing her grandmother's handwriting with one thumb. They moved toward each other without knowing it, two lives on separate tracks curving toward the same point. And as the city's Christmas lights blinked against the growing dark, the stage quietly set itself for the moment when power would meet humility in the bright, merciless glow of a single bank lobby. By the time Camilla stepped off the bus near the branch, the sky had deepened into that in-between hour when streetlights flicker on and Christmas decorations shine brighter than the fading day. Her feet still ached from the shift, but the cold air sharpened her thoughts, and she pressed the envelope closer to her chest, as if borrowing courage from the paper. The bank's glass facade reflected strings of lights from the street, turning the doors into a shimmering doorway between worlds. Outside, the worn sidewalks and tired workers. Inside, polished floors and people who never smelled of fryer oil. Camilla paused for a heartbeat on the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the choice she was about to make. Then she exhaled slowly and pushed the door open, reminding herself that she had every right to walk in. The lobby greeted her with warmth and soft music, a Christmas carol drifting from hidden speakers. The air scented faintly with pine and some expensive cleaning product she could never name. A tall tree stood in the corner, its ornaments gleaming like tiny promises, while garlands wrapped around the railings in perfect symmetry. Camilla took her place at the back of the line, shifting from one foot to the other, trying not to stare at the marble floor or the sleek chairs that looked more like furniture in a hotel than a place where people begged for extensions on loans. Ahead of her, customers in tailored coats and neat briefcases spoke confidently about transfers and investments, their voices low and sure. She glanced down at her uniform, wiped an invisible stain from her shirt, and silently rehearsed the simple sentence she planned to say, "I'd like to check the balance, please." As the line moved forward, she let her mind drift towards small, possible miracles. If there was anything left in that account, maybe she could clear the rent that was choking her month after month, maybe even buy Gabriel the small toy he had pointed at in the shop window, then quickly pretended not to want. She pictured his face waking up to a wrapped box, his arms around her neck, the brief shining moment when money didn't matter. The thought warmed her from the inside, smoothing the tremble in her hands. She felt almost brave, imagining calling the landlord and saying, "It's paid." Imagining going to the grocery store without counting every cent in her head. The envelope didn't feel like superstition anymore. It felt like the last door that might still open. When her turn finally came, she stepped forward and offered the envelope along with her ID, her voice soft but steady as she made her request. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled politely and began typing, the rhythmic tapping of the keys a small comfort in the wide room. For a moment, everything felt ordinary, almost boring, and Camilla allowed herself to breathe as she watched the cursor blink on the screen. Then the teller's smile faltered, her fingers slowing, a small frown knitting her brows as an unexpected message popped up. She clicked again, trying another path, and the screen flashed a warning, a code, a notation she clearly did not understand. The line behind Camilla shuffled impatiently, shoes scuffing on the floor, and her brief feeling of safety thinned like fog in sudden wind. The branch manager, drawn by the slightest hint of delay, appeared at the teller's side, his tie straight, his expression already irritated by the disruption. He scanned the screen, barely glancing at Camilla, his eyes making a quick inventory of her uniform, the tiredness in her face, the kind of look that had judged her entire story in a single second. "It's probably nothing," he muttered, not lowering his voice, as if the words couldn't cut because they weren't meant for her. Small accounts, old files, they clogged the system more than they're worth. The teller's cheeks colored, but she said nothing. Camilla's heart stuttered, her earlier hopes shrinking back into themselves, and a familiar doubt crept up her spine. Perhaps she was foolish to think this place, or that envelope, had ever been meant for someone like her. Never realizing that, just a few steps away, a man who treated people as background noise had already turned his attention toward her, ready to turn this first wound into a spectacle. Blake had drifted closer the moment he heard the manager's bored remark, the scent of a small drama drawing him like cologne. He watched the exchange for a beat, eyes sliding from the glitching screen to the tired waitress in the red shirt, assessing her the way he might scan a line in a balance sheet, Then, with a practiced half-smile, he stepped fully into the scene, his presence tilting the room. "Having trouble with our systems again?" he said lightly, but his gaze stayed on Camilla, not the monitor. To him, it was a perfect moment for a joke, a way to remind everyone who held the highest card in the building. The staff straightened almost instinctively, their bodies learning long ago that his attention, even in jest, could sting. He turned the situation into a performance with casual ease, reading her name tag as if he were granting her a brief spotlight she should feel grateful for. The comments about real accounts and tip change spilled out of him like lines he had delivered 100 times before, the kind of humor that always found its mark in someone smaller. Each laugh from his own mouth fed the armor of his pride, convincing him that the room belonged to him, that every life standing in that lobby existed only to confirm his importance. When the last chuckle faded and he walked away, Blake felt no guilt, only the dull satisfaction of a man who believed he had put someone back in their place. His pride did not allow room for the idea that he might someday soon be the one standing at a counter with nothing left but his name. Camilla, cheeks burning, gathered her envelope with movements that were slow but deliberate, as if each second were another thread she had to pull to keep herself from unraveling. The teller murmured a timid apology, her voice so low it barely reached the space between them, and the manager had already turned away, satisfied that the disruption was over. Camilla's first instinct was to shrink, to apologize for existing, for taking up time, for believing that door had ever been meant for her, but there was another part of her, quieter and older, that stiffened her spine instead. She straightened, thanked the teller in a steady voice that did not match the storm inside, and walked toward the exit without looking back. If they wanted her to beg or cry in front of them, her pride would not allow it. She would bleed on the pavement outside before letting them see the wound. At her station, Sarah watched the red shirt disappear toward the glass doors and felt something ache in her chest. Her fingers, still poised above the keys, moved almost of their own will as she tapped back into the account profile, needing to see what the system had tried to tell her. The same restricted notation flashed up again, clearer now that she looked at it with fresh eyes. Heritage shares, see corporate. It was the kind of phrase that usually hovered around wealthy clients with advisors and reserved rooms upstairs, not women standing in line in restaurant uniforms. "This might be important," Sarah murmured, mostly to herself as she flagged the line and sent a quiet internal message to the manager's inbox, asking whether someone from corporate should review the file. Minutes later, his brusque reply blinked back. "Drop it. Old accounts, low value. Move on." The cursor blinked at the end of that message, an impatient little heartbeat urging her to obey. But Sarah hesitated, feeling the conflict between obedience and conscience tightening in her throat. She knew the rules, knew how quickly a reputation for making trouble could stain a career in a place like this. Yet, the memory of Camilla's face, the way she had held that envelope like it contained her entire life, refused to fade. Outside, unaware of the small act of defiance that had almost happened in her name, Camilla stepped into the cold and wrapped her coat tighter around herself, vowing silently never to walk into that branch again. Her pride, as bruised as it was, built a thin wall around her heart, and behind the glass, a blinking flag stayed where it was, waiting for someone else, somewhere higher up, to finally read what it meant. The apartment felt colder than the street when Camilla unlocked the door, the worn key turning with a small resistance that matched the tension in her chest. She slipped inside quietly, out of habit, as if not to disturb the tired furniture or the shadows clinging to the corners. The hallway light flickered once before staying on, revealing a thin white envelope waiting on the floor, half pushed under the door like an unwelcome foot trying to enter. For a second, she just stared at it, still in her coat, the bank's humiliation replaying in her mind until the words blurred together. Then she bent down and picked it up with fingers that already knew its weight. The landlord's name in the corner, the bold red letters stamped across the front. She opened it at the small kitchen table, the one her grandmother had once scrubbed and polished when she was still strong enough to visit, and unfolded the paper with the weary care of someone who had opened too many bad surprises. The notice was final this time. No more warnings, no more extensions, just a date circled in harsh black ink, a deadline marching toward her like a soldier who did not know mercy. On the counter, another envelope waited, this one from the utility company, corners curled. Words about interruption of service, printed in cold, indifferent type. Camilla laid them side by side, two pieces of paper that seemed to weigh more than any tray she had ever carried at the restaurant. In the middle of the table, the bank envelope, her grandmother's envelope, sat between them like a small, silent witness that had failed to speak up when she needed it most. Gabriel's bedroom door creaked open, and his small face peeked out, hair tousled, eyes heavy with sleep. "Mom," he whispered, rubbing one eye with the back of his hand. "You're home late. Did you have a lot of customers?" Camilla forced her voice into softness, folding the eviction notice in half and sliding it under the electric bill with the quick, practiced motion of someone hiding knives. "Yeah, baby," she said, managing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Lots of plates, lots of coffee. Go on back to bed, okay?" He nodded, then hesitated in the doorway. "Mom, if we have to move, will Santa still find us?" The question hung in the air, like a fragile ornament about to drop, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She crossed the room and pulled him into her arms, kissing his hair, promising, "He'll always find you, I promise." No. When he was tucked back into bed, the apartment sank into silence again, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and a distant siren somewhere in the city. Camilla returned to the table, where the three envelopes waited like a jury: the landlord, the electric company, and the bank that had laughed at her. She picked up her grandmother's envelope and turned it over in her hands, feeling the thinness of the paper, the softness worn into it by years of being moved and saved and believed in. For the first time, anger joined the sorrow in her chest. Not just at Blake, not just at the manager, but at the dream itself, at the idea that patience and sacrifice would always be rewarded. "You were wrong, Va," she whispered, the words tasting like betrayal and grief, even as her eyes filled. "They don't see us. They never did." In a sharp, desperate motion, she opened the drawer beside the table, the one where menus and old receipts and rubber bands went to disappear, and shoved the envelope inside, pushing it to the very back. It caught on something, resisting as if the wood itself did not want to swallow it, but she forced it down, needing the illusion that she could bury this disappointment along with it. The drawer refused to close all the way, stopping with a small gap, the corner of the envelope just barely visible in the dim kitchen light, like a stubborn ghost of her grandmother's faith. Camilla turned away, wiping her eyes with the heel of her hand, and whispered into the empty room that there was nothing there, nothing to save them, nothing to hope for. She didn't see how that tiny strip of paper still showing would become the thread the future would pull on, nor how, at that very moment, in a different building lit by the same December night, a computer system quietly blinked to life, flagging her name and that same forgotten account for someone who was about to notice what the bank, and she herself, had just tried to throw away. Night settled over the building like a heavy blanket, muting the sounds of the street and deepening the shadows in every corner of the small apartment. After Gabriel finally drifted back to sleep, his breathing soft and even, Camilla closed his bedroom door with care, leaving it slightly ajar the way he liked. The living room felt strangely big without his voice, the silence pressing against her ears until she could hear the faint ticking of a clock she had stopped checking weeks ago. She sat at the kitchen table again, the overhead light casting a circle of pale yellow that made everything beyond it seem farther away, less real. For a long moment, she just stared at the drawer where she had shoved the envelope, feeling as if it were staring back at her. Her hand moved instead toward the old picture frame propped near the salt shaker, the one with her grandmother's face smiling in soft black and white. Elena's eyes, still bright even after the years and the cheap print, seemed to look straight through her, unbothered by rent notices or cruel laughter. "Why did you believe in them so much?" Camilla whispered, tracing the outline of her grandmother's cheek with one finger. "Why that bank? Why those people?" The questions came out cracked and tired, not really meant to be answered. She thought of Elena mopping those polished floors, humming hymns under her breath, saving coins in a jar because she trusted numbers and patience more than promises. Tonight, that faith felt like a story from another world. On the shelf above the table rested Elena's old Bible, its spine worn, pages freckled with tiny notes in the margins. Camilla reached for it without quite knowing why, the cover soft and familiar in her hands. When she opened it, a pressed flower fell onto the table, brittle and pale, smelling faintly of dust and memory. She flipped through the pages, noticing underlined verses about justice, about the poor and the humble being precious in God's eyes, about wrongs being made right in time. Normally those words comforted her, like warm hands around a cold cup, but tonight they sounded far away, like a song playing in another room behind a closed door. "How long is in time, Vo?" she asked the empty kitchen, her voice barely louder than a breath. Tears came then, not dramatic, just slow and steady, running down her cheeks as if they had been waiting all day for permission to fall. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth to muffle the small, broken sounds that slipped out, not wanting Gabriel to wake up and see her like this. All the pieces of the day tumbled together in her mind. The tired bus, the gleaming bank, Blake's laughter, the final notice on the table, the stubborn drawer that wouldn't close. For the first time, a bitter thought crept into her heart. Maybe hard work and kindness were just pretty words people used to comfort themselves when the world chose someone else. Maybe dignity wasn't enough to keep the lights on or the roof above their heads. She picked up the photograph again and held it against her chest, closing her eyes, letting the quiet swallow her whole. "I don't know what to do," she admitted into the fabric of her shirt, the words soaking into the darkness like spilled water. In another part of the city, lit by fluorescent bulbs and reflected on glass walls, a lone employee sat at a computer, frowning at a line of text with her grandmother's name on it, and the word heritage glowing beside it. Fingers moved over a keyboard, opening files, following a trail that led inevitably to Camilla's forgotten envelope. But in the small apartment, with the hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of distant traffic, Camilla knew nothing of that. All she felt was the weight of doubt pressing down on her shoulders, unaware that somewhere beyond her despair, something in her story had quietly begun to turn. In a quieter part of the city, far from the worn stairs of Camilla's building, the investment division of the bank hummed beneath the harsh white light of late-night overtime. Elias Moretti, a compliance officer known for reading the small print no one else had patience for, rubbed his eyes and took another sip of lukewarm coffee. His screen was cluttered with alerts and routine checks, most of them mechanical, the kind of work that blurred together into a single long line of numbers. One particular alert, however, refused to fade into the background, a notification tagged Heritage Shares, Manual Review Required. He clicked it almost out of habit, expecting another minor discrepancy to clear and forget, not realizing he was opening a file that had been waiting years for a human being to truly see it. The name on the screen made him pause. Elena Oliveira, an account opened decades earlier with small, consistent purchases of the bank's own stock. Elias scrolled through the history, eyebrows lifting as he watched the timeline unfold. Tiny amounts invested month after month, then quarter after quarter, growing slowly along with the bank itself. It wasn't the largest portfolio he had ever seen, but it was substantial, especially for someone whose listed occupation had once been night cleaner. And attached to the profile was a legal clause, old and almost forgotten, requesting that in the event of Elena's death, her designated heir be contacted personally before any change to the account. The system had flagged a recent attempt to access the linked savings line. The heir's name, Camila Oliveira. Curiosity stirred in Elias's chest, pushing aside the fatigue. He opened the related records and saw the note from the local branch. A balance inquiry that had gone nowhere, an internal flag ignored, no follow-up request for corporate guidance. Beneath the dry language, he could almost picture the scene. Someone walking into a branch with an old envelope, hoping for answers, leaving with none. Why didn't anyone escalate this? He murmured to himself, scrolling down to the contact information. A phone number, an address in a modest neighborhood, a notation about a recent visit that had been closed with the words, "No further action required." The phrase tasted wrong to him, like a door slammed on a hand reaching through. He checked the share count again, did a quick calculation, and felt a quiet, stunned respect for the woman who had built it $1 at a time. He pinged the local branch through the internal chat system, requesting more context, and the reply came from a teller whose name he recognized from prior routine exchanges, Sarah. Her answer was short at first, professional, but after a brief pause, more messages followed, hesitant then more direct. She described what she had seen on Christmas Eve, a young waitress, the CEO's laughter, the manager's dismissal, her own attempt to flag the account. The words on the screen carried more emotion than any report form could, and Elias felt his jaw tighten as the pieces fell into place. Someone precious to the bank on paper had been treated as disposable in its lobby, and the irony felt like a stain spreading across the institution's polished image. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the city through the small slice of window near his desk, lights blinking like distant stars above streets he rarely walked at night. The handbook told him he could simply send a letter, note the file and move on. But the clause in Elena's account, the insistence on a personal contact with her heir, weighed on him like a quiet obligation. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the phone instead. His fingers dialed the number linked to Camilla's name, the line ringing out into the dark, toward an apartment where doubt and exhaustion had just begun to settle into uneasy sleep. And somewhere between his steady breathing and the distant hum of the building, a thin thread of possibility stretched across the city, fragile, almost invisible, but strong enough to tug gently at a life that believed there was nothing left to hope for. The phone on the counter vibrated against a pile of unopened mail, its small light blinking in the dim kitchen like a hesitant knock on the door of her sleep. Camilla stirred on the couch, a thin blanket twisted around her legs, the exhaustion of the past days wrapped around her like a second skin. It took her a moment to understand that the sound wasn't part of a dream. Then she reached blindly for the phone, squinting at the unknown number glowing on the screen. Bill collector, she thought automatically, thumb hovering over the option to ignore. The world had taught her that calls from strangers usually meant someone else wanted something she didn't have. She answered anyway, more out of reflex than hope. A calm, male voice introduced himself. "My name is Elias Moretti. I work with the investment division of your bank," and every muscle in her body tensed. The word bank felt like a bruise pressed too soon. Camilla almost hung up, but there was something in his tone, formal yet strangely careful, that made her pause. He mentioned her grandmother's full name, pronounced it correctly, spoke of a specific account opened decades ago, of a clause requesting personal contact with the heir. His words were precise, like steps on a delicate bridge, and though suspicion flared, it fought with a tiny, stubborn spark of recognition. He knew things that had never been written in any bill. "I'm not interested in more fees or loans," she cut in, her voice rough from sleep and days of swallowed tears. Elias didn't sound offended. Instead, he took a breath and repeated that he wasn't selling anything, that his job was to make sure certain promises were honored. He referenced a phrase from Elena's letter, almost word for word, about saving "for you and your future, my granddaughter." And the phone nearly slipped from Camilla's hand. How could he know that? Papers rustled softly on his end of the line, and he explained that he had been reviewing her grandmother's investment records, that there were matters too complex and too important to discuss over the phone. "Would she be willing to come to the main office after the holidays?" he asked gently, "so they could talk face to face?" Camilla paced the small kitchen, the floor cold under her feet, torn between fear of being deceived and fear of missing the one thin rope being lowered into the pit where her life seemed to be sinking. Scams, she knew, loved words like inheritance and opportunity. But scammers didn't usually know the exact date her grandmother had opened the account, or the name of the street Elena used to clean, or the reserved little joke she'd made about owning at least a tiny piece of the building. Elias mentioned each of these details with the kind of respect that made her chest ache. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "Just think about coming in. You deserve to know what your grandmother did for you." When they hung up, the apartment felt different. No less small, no less fragile, but as if one of the walls had quietly shifted an inch. Days later, with Christmas fading into the soft blur of used wrapping paper and packed away ornaments in other people's homes, Camilla stood in front of a very different bank building. This one rose high and gleaming, all glass and steel, a logo larger than her entire living room, shining above a sweeping entrance. She had braided her hair back neatly, put on her cleanest blouse and a simple dark coat, and slipped Gabriel's drawing into her bag, like a silent blessing. As the revolving doors turned and the marble lobby opened before her, filled with carefully arranged plants and the faint scent of expensive soap, her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She paused on the threshold, fingers tightening around the strap of her bag, and for an instant every wound from the branch visit flared alive again, before a receptionist's warm smile and the sound of her own name being spoken with respect pulled her one step deeper into a place that might either break her all over again, or finally prove that her grandmother's faith had been waiting here, all along, to be seen. The conference room where they took her was smaller than she expected and quieter than any lobby. Soft grey walls, a long wooden table, a window that framed a slice of the city like a painting. Elias stood as she entered, smoothing his tie with a nervous gesture that didn't match the serious title on his badge. Beside him sat a woman in her 50s with silver at her temples and a calm, observant gaze. He introduced her as Margaret, a senior advisor. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Oliveira," Margaret said, gesturing toward a chair, her tone gentle in a way that felt almost out of place in such a formal space. Camilla's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she sat, feeling the old instinct to apologize for taking up room. But for once, she stayed silent and waited. Elias opened a folder and slid a few printed pages toward her, lists of dates and numbers she didn't recognize, graphs with lines that climbed steadily upward. "Your grandmother was remarkably disciplined," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Over many years she purchased small amounts of our bank stock, A few dollars at a time, sometimes less. She never sold. She just kept believing. He walked her through the history, his pen tapping lightly on certain columns, translating the dry language of investments into something she could understand. With each explanation, the same phrase repeated in her head. She did this for you. The numbers at the bottom of the page were big enough that for a heartbeat, she thought they must belong to someone else. At first, Camilla couldn't speak. The idea that the tired woman who came home smelling of cleaning chemicals had been quietly building something so large felt like discovering her grandmother had hidden a whole other life inside the one she already knew. "You're saying, this is mine?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded, and Margaret leaned forward, hands folded. "Yes. Enough to clear your immediate debts, enough to give your son stability, enough to breathe." A breath she didn't know she'd been holding escaped her chest in a shaky rush, and her eyes burned hot. She thought of the eviction notice, the drawer that wouldn't close, the envelope she'd almost torn in two. Gratitude swelled up wild and overwhelming, crashing against years of scarcity and fear. But then Margaret turned another page and tapped a different set of numbers, smaller than the big total, but marked with a different symbol. "There is something else," she said. "Your grandmother didn't just buy savings, she bought ownership." She explained that the shares Elena had accumulated were not only valuable, they were voting shares, a slice of influence that reached all the way to the boardroom. "This means you have a voice, Ms. Oliveira, in how this institution is run," Margaret continued. "It is not a majority, but it is significant enough that we are obligated, and frankly, morally bound, to inform you of certain decisions, including those concerning our leadership." The word leadership seemed to thicken the air between them. Images flashed in Camilla's mind, the marble floor of the branch, Blake's laughter bouncing off Christmas ornaments, the way everyone had looked away. Her hand drifted to her bag, fingers brushing the edge of the very envelope that had been mocked like a joke. She looked up at Elias and Margaret, seeing not only professionals, but people watching her with something like expectation, maybe even hope. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Margaret exchanged a brief glance with Elias, then answered, "Because the board will soon be convening a special meeting to discuss recent concerns about our direction and our CEO's conduct. As a key shareholder, we would like you to be there, to hear, to decide, to vote if you wish." The room seemed to tilt for a moment, the idea too big to fit into the life she had brought in with her. And as she stared at the invitation hidden inside those careful words, a single tremor of fear and fierce, quiet resolve ran through her, opening a question that hung between them like a bridge. What would she do with power placed in the hands of someone who had just learned she'd had it all along? The boardroom felt like a different world from the lobby where Camilla had once stood invisible, all dark wood and glass, with the city spread out beyond the windows like a map of every life there. Decisions touched. She sat near the end of the long table, the same worn envelope tucked neatly into her bag, a quiet talisman against the polished surface and expensive suits. Men and women filed in, some with cautious curiosity in their eyes, others with the distracted confidence of people used to being obeyed. Nameplates gleamed in front of each seat, but when she glanced down, the simple card with Camila Oliveira, printed in crisp black letters, felt heavier than all the rest. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers laced together to keep them from trembling, while her grandmother's voice whispered somewhere in the back of her mind, "You belong here, more than they know." Blake entered with the same easy stride he had carried into the branch on Christmas Eve, a practiced smile already in place, his suit immaculate, his tie knotted just so. For the first few seconds, he didn't truly see her. She was just another shape at the table, another pair of eyes in the room. Then his gaze snagged on her face, and he stopped mid-step, the smile freezing like a photograph that had just cracked down the middle. Recognition flared, followed by disbelief, then a flicker of something like annoyance that she had dared to appear in this sanctified space. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, forcing his voice back into its usual smooth register as he took his seat at the head of the table. But the words rang slightly hollow around the edges. The meeting began in the language of reports and percentages, compliance updates, performance graphs, mentions of public perception, and reputational risk. Camilla listened, the terms washing over her like a foreign tide, but every now and then a word stood out sharp and clear: complaints, investigation, incident. At one point, a director from the ethics committee referred delicately to a customer interaction at one of our branches that has raised concerns. And though no names were spoken, the memory of laughter and Christmas lights flashed through Camilla's mind like a jolt. Across the table, Blake shifted in his chair, the muscles in his jaw tightening, as if he too saw the garlands, the tree, the girl he had turned into a punchline. But when he spoke, he tried to make it sound small, distant, irrelevant, a misunderstanding, an isolated moment, a regrettable miscommunication. As questions sharpened and the tone of the room cooled, it became harder for him to pretend that nothing serious was happening. One director mentioned that several employees at the branch had expressed discomfort about what they had witnessed. Another noted that the incident had reached the ears of key clients who were watching how the bank handled less visible customers. Blake attempted to steer the conversation back to numbers, to profits and growth, and the awards the bank had won, but the words sounded brittle, like glass strained to its limit. All the while, Camilla sat in silence, the envelope in her bag pressing against her side, feeling the eyes of a few board members flick toward her with growing interest. They knew her surname now, knew the story behind the shares she held, and that knowledge hung over the table like a storm cloud waiting to break. Finally, the chair of the board cleared his throat and turned toward her, his expression respectful but intent. "Ms. Oliveira," he said, and the room quieted in an instant, every rustle of paper stilled. "You are here today not only as a beneficiary of your grandmother's investments, but as a significant shareholder and as someone directly affected by the incident in question. Before we proceed further, we would like to hear from you, if you are willing to speak." For a heartbeat, the only sound Camilla heard was the rush of her own blood in her ears. She felt Blake's gaze on her like a weight, heavy and disbelieving, as if his pride could still insist that she sit down, stay quiet, remain who she had been in the lobby. Slowly, she opened her bag under the table, fingertips brushing the edge of the envelope he had mocked, and when she lifted her eyes, there was a new steadiness in them, the fragile beginning of a choice that would shape not only his future, but her own understanding of what it truly meant to carry her grandmother's name. For a moment, Camilla thought her voice might fail her, that the words would crumble into silence under the weight of all those eyes. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was calm and clear. She did not start with Blake or with Christmas Eve. She started with Elena, her grandmother with the mop and the bucket, the woman who had polished this very bank's floors while others slept. She spoke of long nights and aching backs, of coins dropped into a jar on a kitchen table, of a faith so stubborn it chose to buy shares in the very institution that barely knew her name. As she talked, the room seemed to recede a little, the polished wood and sharp collars blurring around the image of that small woman, humming hymns as she worked. The story was simple, almost plain, but it settled over the table like a quiet tide, lifting and rearranging everything it touched. Then she brought them, gently but firmly, to the lobby on Christmas Eve. She described the garlands and the tree, the music playing softly overhead, the way the envelope had felt in her hands, as if her whole life had been folded inside it and carried across the city. She did not exaggerate Blake's words, did not twist them. She repeated them exactly as they had been said, each syllable landing heavier now that the man who'd spoken them sat just a few feet away. She mentioned the staff turning away, the silence that followed the laughter, the moment she wondered if her grandmother's belief had been a mistake. Her tone never rose, never sharpened into accusation, but the truth in it was sharper than any shouted anger could have been. Around the table, a few board members lowered their eyes, seeing in her account not just one incident, but a mirror they had avoided for a long time. "I am not here to destroy anyone," she said after a pause that let the weight of her story settle. "I know what it is to make mistakes. I know what it is to be tired and say things you shouldn't. But I also know what it feels like to be treated as if your life doesn't matter, as if you are just background noise in someone else's success." Her gaze moved briefly across the room, not lingering on any one face, yet touching each of them in turn. She spoke of dignity, of how every person who walked into a branch carried invisible burdens, eviction notices, medical bills, dreams wrapped in paper envelopes just like hers. "My grandmother didn't buy these shares so I could humiliate anyone," she finished softly. "She bought them so that one day someone like her and like me might be seen." A quiet shifted through the room, the kind that comes when people realize the conversation has moved from numbers to conscience. One board member cleared his throat and admitted with a careful honesty that he had been uneasy for some time about the gap between the bank's public image and the way its smallest clients were treated. Another, an older woman with sharp eyes, spoke about employees who feared speaking up, about complaints that had been managed rather than understood. Slowly, without drama, a pattern emerged that had little to do with profit margins and everything to do with the culture Blake had allowed to grow under his watch. Camilla listened, hands folded, as others finally said aloud what she had lived. That leadership was measured not by how a CEO courted investors, but by how he treated the person standing in line at the end of a long day. When the time came to discuss Blake's future, his defenses sounded different in the air that her testimony had cleared. The old charm felt thinner, the confident phrases more like armor than truth. He spoke of pressure, of expectations, of moments taken out of context, and there was some truth in that. She could see it. He was not a monster, only a man who had let pride grow so tall it blocked his view of the ground. The board chair finally turned to her and asked, with grave respect, how she intended to use her vote. Camilla's fingers brushed the outline of the envelope in her bag, the same one that had been laughed at, and she drew a slow breath, feeling both the weight of her grandmother's sacrifice and the trembling possibility of doing something different from revenge. As she opened her mouth to answer, her decision poised between justice and mercy. The room held its breath, waiting to see not just what would happen to a CEO, but what kind of woman a lifetime of quiet struggle had shaped her to be. The room was very still when Camilla finally spoke, her hands resting quietly on the table, the worn envelope a small weight against her side. She did not use complicated language. She simply said that she would cast her vote for any leadership that treated every client as if the envelope in their hands carried their whole life, whether it held $10 or 10 million. Her words were soft, but they landed with the firmness of a stone dropped into deep water. Around the table, heads nodded slowly, some in agreement, some in reluctant acknowledgement that a line had been drawn. When the board chair called for the vote on Blake's future, a quiet current moved through the room, not of anger, but of overdue honesty. Hands rose, one after another, in favor of his removal as CEO, some hesitant, others with a sense of weary relief, as if they had been waiting a long time for permission to do what they already knew was right. The motion passed, the decision recorded in clean black ink that would one day read like a simple administrative change. But for Camilla, it felt like the closing of a door that had once slammed in her face, now gently pushed open from the other side. Blake sat very still, his jaw tight, the practiced smile gone from his features. For the first time, he looked around the table and seemed to understand that the room did not belong to him, and that the woman he had laughed at in the lobby now shared responsibility for the ground shifting under his feet. When the meeting ended, the board members drifted out in low clusters of conversation, and Camilla stepped into the hallway, the air cooler there, the carpet swallowing the sound of her steps. She thought only of reaching the elevator, of calling Gabriel, of going home to a place where no one wore nameplates or $1,000 watches. "Ms. Oliveira." The voice behind her was quieter than she remembered, stripped of its casual arrogance. She turned to see Blake standing a few paces away, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes carrying a kind of stunned weariness she had never imagined on his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence held all the power that had once been used to belittle her, now strangely weightless in the corridor. His apology came out imperfect and halting, like a man trying to speak a language he had never bothered to learn. He said he was sorry for the words in the branch, but also for the way he had learned to measure people, by shoes, by accents, by the size of their accounts, until they became numbers instead of souls. He did not ask her to change the board's decision or pretend nothing had happened. He simply admitted that for the first time in years he could see the cost of his pride. Camilla listened, feeling the old anger stir and then soften, not because what he had done was small, but because she refused to let that single moment define the rest of her life. When she answered, her voice was steady. She told him she forgave him, not to erase the past, but to make sure her heart did not stay trapped under the laughter he had once thrown at her like a stone. Time folded its edges, and months later the bank's name appeared on simple posters around the city. The Elena Fund, supporting workers, single parents, and new beginnings. In a modest community hall smelling of coffee and fresh paint, rows of folding chairs filled with faces that looked a lot like hers once had. Tired, hopeful, carrying envelopes full of worries and small dreams. At the front, a small plaque with Elena's name rested beside a microphone waiting under warm yellow lights. Backstage, Camilla stood with Gabriel's latest drawing tucked into her bag, smoothing the front of her dress with hands that still remembered trays and dishes, but now also contracts and votes. When someone called her name and invited her to the podium, she stepped toward the light, feeling her heart pound. Not with fear of being small, but with the fragile, trembling sense that the next words she spoke could change more than just her own story, and wondering how exactly she would begin to honor the woman whose faith had carried her this far. Mornings in Camilla's new home began with light instead of fear, sunlight spilling across a modest kitchen where the table now held school books and crayons instead of eviction notices. Gabriel sat in his usual chair, swinging his legs as he talked about planets and history instead of whether they would have to move. The hum of the refrigerator was no longer a threat, just part of the gentle background of their life. Bills still arrived, responsibilities still existed, but they met them with plans, not panic. The old envelope, now carefully preserved in a folder, rested in a drawer that closed all the way. Camilla still chose to work a few days a week, in a smaller restaurant where the owner asked how she was sleeping, not just when she could cover another shift. She moved between tables with the same grace she had always carried, but now her back was not bowed by invisible weight. On some afternoons, she left early to pick up Gabriel from school, listening as he chatted about a science project funded by a local scholarship program she secretly knew the Elena Fund had helped sponsor. In quiet moments, she sat by the window with a cup of coffee. She didn't have to water down, simply watching the world and allowing herself to exist without apologizing for taking up space. For the first time, her value felt anchored in something deeper than the numbers in an account. The bank changed in ways that didn't make headlines, but mattered more than any glossy campaign. Branches added extra chairs near the counters for tired feet. Training sessions taught tellers how to listen before they judged. Complaint forms became conversations instead of problems to be buried. In the lobby, where she had once been humiliated, a small framed plaque now hung near the entrance. In honor of Elena Oliveira, who believed every life deserves respect. Some people walked past without noticing. Others paused, reading the name with a thoughtful tilt of the head. Sarah, still working there, sometimes glanced at it and smiled, remembering the night she chose not to look away. As for Blake, his life did not disappear in disgrace. It narrowed, then slowly grew in a different direction. Without the title of CEO to hide behind, he found himself standing in small community rooms instead of boardrooms, helping teach financial literacy classes to people who reminded him of the woman he once laughed at. At first, he did it because he felt he had to, a sort of penance demanded by the new order, but over time, the stories he heard began to sink into the cracks pride had left in him. He remained imperfect, still learning, but on certain evenings, locking up after a workshop, he would look at the worn chairs and think of a red shirt, a paper envelope, and a second chance he hadn't deserved but had been given anyway. The Elena Fund grew quietly, one approved application at a time, helping a bus driver cover a surgery, a single mother keep her lights on, an elderly couple stay in the home where their memories lived. Camilla reviewed some of the stories, tears sometimes blurring the words, seeing pieces of her own past in each request. Wealth, she realized, was not the balance alone, but what it allowed you to heal, to protect, to plant for others. On a calm evening, after Gabriel had gone to bed, she stood by the window watching the city lights wink like distant candles and whispered, "We did it, Va. They see us now." Drill. And if this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.